Hello, I'm Dean Peter Baker, and welcome to Ethical Armouring. In this course, we're going to do three main things. First, I'm going to introduce you to ethics in general, the broad main ideas of ethics as they apply to our society at large. Then we're going to focus in on military ethics and look at the principles, the key principles that define the military profession. And finally, we're going to look at some ethical risk factors, factors that for individuals put us on a potential path of making poor ethical decisions. So I hope you'll enjoy it. Glad you could join me. So I want to start by drawing your attention to this image on the screen. And it's an image I found accidentally, but it really does make a lot of sense for the course that we're doing. So the picture is of a World War I or maybe a little bit after World War I soldier. He's a US Army soldier, and he's modeling body armor. And this is captured body armor captured from German soldiers in the trenches of World War I. And as you can see, it's very much improvised body armor. It's kind of cool looking, but it's very much improvised. And this was quite a common practice in World War I, where essentially what would happen is people in the trenches would, in their spare time, kind of cobble together bits of metal to create armor of their own. And there was also the commercial supply of some kinds of armor from private companies who are manufacturing their own versions and selling them mainly to parents who would then send them on to their young men at the front in World War I. And the reason I think this is relevant is because this is very much how we do our own personal ethical armoring in general. Most of us have a good sense of ethics. We have a fairly clear idea of right and wrong. But that sense, if you like, that armoring has been cobbled together over time. We've got bits of it from our family, we've got bits of it from our friends, from perhaps our workplaces, from our broader context, and we've cobbled that together to give us the ethical armoring that we employ. What we're trying to do in this course is to give you something that's maybe a little bit more tried and tested, a little bit more seamless with fewer cracks in between, and hopefully something that's going to give you better ethical protection. So that's why we're here. We're here to consider ethical armoring. And I want to start you off with this image. This is something put together by our colleagues in the Canadian Defence Force. It was designed by a friend of mine, Deanna Messavi. And she designed this model, and essentially it's the defense ethics decision-making model for the CDF, the Canadian Defence Force. And really what I want to focus in on is the part in the middle of the screen where you've got the word recognition, and above it you've got the words type 1 and below type 2. And what this is pointing out to us is something that we probably realize quite intuitively, is that there are two main ways that we make ethical decisions. We make decisions in a more intuitive way, and we make decisions in a more deliberate, cognitively applied way. So on the one hand, and this is true of all decisions, it's true of ethical decisions, but it's also true of all decisions. So very often, the decisions we make are those everyday intuitive ones, where we don't even really think about it, but we've got to make a decision. It would be inefficient for us to start to try to think it through and ponder over every decision. We make a decision, a lot of the time we're not even aware we've actually done so. So think of this example. Imagine you're walking through the office and you see a colleague has left his or her wallet on their desk. And as you walk past and you make the decision not to steal that wallet. At least I hope that's a decision you make. So you've made a decision, and you probably are not even aware that you've done so. That's the intuitive type decision making that we do all the time. So there's a lot to be said for that kind of decision making. It's very efficient, but there are shortcomings. It's not very high resolution, as we'll talk about later on. The other type of decision is where we find ourselves confronted with a decision that requires more thought. It's an ethical problem that's a little bit nuttier. It's not obvious what the right thing to do is, and so we have to stop and think about it. And that's the type 2 decision. So in the first part of this course, we're going to focus on type 2 decision making, on those formal models or formal rules of thumb that can help us to make better decisions, ethically speaking. But then we'll come back to type 1 thinking, because that's where a lot of the ethical risk factors apply. So that's the direction we're going in. So to start then, there are essentially three main approaches to ethics. And these are three approaches that we find throughout our community. These are three approaches that when you're introduced to them will seem very familiar. And that makes a lot of sense. These are broad approaches within the Western tradition, but we see strong echoes in other cultures as well. So I'm going to introduce you to all three. But before I do that, I want you to think about this scenario, just as a thought experiment to get you thinking about ethics. So imagine this situation. You have got out of the military, you've made that choice, you've left the military, you've gone back to university, and you've decided to study medicine. You study medicine, turns out you're very good at it, and you become a transplant surgeon. So congratulations, you're now earning far more money. Well, here's the situation that you face one day. So you have a patient, and your patient is a woman who has kidney failure. And so her situation is that she has lost one kidney due to kidney disease, and the other one is on its way out. And so she desperately needs a transplant. If she doesn't get a transplant, she will die, and obviously that's a bad outcome. The good news is her husband, who is very much in love with her, turns out to be a match, and he's more than willing to offer one of his kidneys to save her life. So that's great news. So far, no ethical quandary to think about. But here's where the challenge for you comes in. One day, just before the operation is about to go ahead, you find yourself in your patient's room, you're checking some charts or whatever it is that surgeons do, and you hear her on the phone. You're not trying to listen in, you're certainly being polite, you wouldn't do that, but she's not trying to hide her conversation, you can't help but overhearing, and pretty quickly it becomes evident to you what the situation is. And the situation is she's talking on her phone to her divorce lawyer. And as the conversation goes on, it becomes clear that she has someone else on the scene. She's intending to divorce her husband and leave him, but she's going to wait until she's taken his kidney in order to do that. And so you have an ethical quandary. What should you do? Should you speak up and say something to her husband or not? Now, you'll have a fundamental intuition about this, what the right thing to do is. And what I want you to do is just to think about that, park it to one side, maybe even jot it down. I think the surgeon should do this. We're going to come back to this scenario in several times to illustrate these three approaches to ethics that we're going to consider. So we come now to the first of the three main approaches to ethics that I want to talk about. And I've given it this title of constraints. And I don't actually really like the title constraints because in many ways this reflects a negative view that we often have about ethics, that it's a set of rules that hold us back, that stop us doing what needs to be done. I think that image on the screen tries to capture that concern that we sometimes have. And I do sometimes have this discussion with people in the military. This idea that, for example, if we stick by the ethical rules when we're fighting in combat, we give the enemy an advantage because they choose not to. So it's this idea of constraints, of somehow we are tying our hands behind our back. And I don't like that because I think that misrepresents the nature of ethical rules. And that's what I'm really talking about in this part. It's ethical rules and permissions that give us our left and right of arc. These are our constraints. And a better way to think about this is in terms of respect. So yes, they are constraints, but they are constraints that are underpinned by our sense of respect for other people. And I'll talk about that idea of respect in a little bit more detail in a second. So when I'm talking about constraints, I'm thinking of respect. And think again of that example I gave earlier, where you're walking along, you walk through the office, you walk past a colleague's desk, and their wallet is on the desk, and you choose not to steal their wallet. Now, one way to think of that is perhaps you could go, well, there are all these rules that hold me back. These are my constraints. I wish they weren't there because they stop me from doing things I would otherwise want to do. But of course, that's not what you're thinking. If you did stop to think about it, that wouldn't be what you were thinking about why you didn't steal that wallet. Rather, what you're thinking is something like, no, it's not for me to take that because it's not my property. It's the other person's property. It's up to them to choose what they do with their property. Out of respect for them, respecting their choices, it's not for me to take that wallet. So that's what I'm trying to get at when I think that these rules, these ethical principles, are about respect. So let's start by talking about the first of these three main approaches to ethics that I want to highlight. And as you can see on the screen, I've labeled this constraints, but I don't really like the term constraints. And the reason I've used it is it starts with a C, and the other two do as well. So you'll see that we've got 3 C's here. But the reason I don't like the term constraints is because, as the image depicts on the screen, we tend to think of it as ethics being about holding us back. And I certainly have that kind of conversation quite often in the military. I have conversations with people who say, well, why do we have to stick to ethics? Aren't we just tying our hands behind our back? We're engaging with an enemy often who certainly doesn't hold to ethical principles. And so these constraints are seen as a kind of a negative. But I think that's a misunderstanding of the nature of the kinds of principles that I'm talking about here. So here I am talking about ethical rules or ethical principles. And when I think about these ethical rules or principles, I'm really not thinking about them as a way to hold you back. What I'm thinking of is rules that at their base are about respect for others. So let me take you back to that scenario I gave you a bit earlier. Everyday scenario, you're walking through the office, you see that a colleague has left their wallet on the desk, and you make the choice not to steal that wallet. Now, one way you could potentially think of that is because you're not doing it because there are a bunch of rules that hold you back from things that you would otherwise do. But of course, that's not really what's going on when you choose not to steal the wallet. If you did stop and think about it, which you probably wouldn't, but if you did stop to think about it and work through, well, why is it that I chose not to steal? In the end, it would boil down to your sense of respect for the other person, that you have a view that their property is theirs to dispose of, is theirs to choose what to do with, and it's not up to you to violate that. So you're respecting them as rational agents, as people who make choices for themselves, as people who have free will. And I think that rule-based ethics really does almost always boil down to that sense of ethics. And so we are talking about rule-based ethics here, and this is what philosophers call deontological ethics. Don't worry too much about the terminology, but again, it's this idea of the rules. Sometimes they're rules that constrain us, but they can include permissions. The rules can give us permissions to do things, sometimes things that other people can't do. So with this kind of way of thinking, ethics then is defined by adherence to the rules, or we might think of them also as a set of duties. And there are very many different codes of ethics that fall into this kind of category. You can probably think of a number yourself. A well-known example from the world of religion would be the 10 Commandments. It's a literal set of do's and don'ts, the rules that tell you how to behave. And that's a really good example of deontological ethics. But there are many others as well. So before my current job at UNSW Canberra, I taught at the US Naval Academy. And at the Naval Academy, they have a thing called the Honor Code, which is a little bit misleading as a title, because as we'll see later, honor really falls into a different category. It talks about the idea of virtue. But the Honor Code at the Naval Academy is really a rule-based or a deontological set of ethics. And the simple summary of the Honor Code is that a midshipman will not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate anybody who does. So you can see there, straightforward set of rules. You will not do these things. And that's another kind of an example. There are some examples also that include special duties. So here we're talking about ethical rules or permissions that are limited to specific people in specific contexts. Sometimes, and quite often, they are around the profession of the person involved. So think, for example, of lawyers. If you and I know of someone who has committed a serious crime, our responsibility is to go and tell someone, is to go and report that. But if you're a lawyer and somebody tells you they've committed a serious crime, you have very different duties to them. So you have special duties that relate to your profession. We might think also of clergy, particularly say the Catholic Church, where they have special duties of confidence in the case of the confession, of the confessional. So you can see that there are some kinds of professions that have particular ethical duties that don't apply elsewhere. And that's true of the military, as we'll see later on. Other kinds of ethical duties are quite individual. So if you make a promise, you then have a special duty that other people don't have. One example of that kind of promise would be wedding vows. If you say that if you marry somebody, you utter a number of oaths, a number of promises that you commit yourself to, that you alone have those duties to that person that you are married. Nobody else has those particular duties. And so the examples could go on. Sometimes they are special duties that we don't enter into by any kind of deliberate act or by choosing to enter into a special duty, but that happen to us organically. For example, you become a parent. As you become a parent, you and your co-parent have unique duties to that child that nobody else has. So we have special duties as well. Again, many different kinds of codes that we could talk about. From a philosophical perspective, the dominant approach is the approach put forward by Immanuel Kant. So if you're thinking philosophically about deontological ethics, the first person who always comes to mind is Immanuel Kant and his approach. And Kant is doing his thinking in a time where things were changing in his world. So this was Europe, obviously. He was a German and a Prussian, and he was doing his thinking at a time where the dominant worldview was starting to give just a little bit. And in that time and space, the dominant worldview was obviously Christianity. So prior to this time, if you were to ask the question, what should I do? What's the ethical thing to do? The straightforward answer is you do what your religion tells you. You follow the 10 Commandments, for example, or you love your neighbor as yourself, and so on. You draw on the principles that exist within that faith tradition and that broader view of the world. But Kant is starting to do his thinking at a time where that dominant worldview is starting to give just a little bit. And there are some people who are starting to look for ways to answer the question, what should I do, that don't draw on that particular metaphysic or that particular religious view. And so Kant is starting to do that, and he's asking himself, well, what could be the basis of ethics? What is it that makes human beings special and unique? Why is it, to put it another way, that we think that humans are at the pinnacle of our ethical responsibilities? If we think of ethics as a kind of triangle where we've got broad responsibilities to all sorts of things, but really at the top we owe the most to fellow human beings, why is that? Kant says, why are we special? Why do we stand out? And he comes to this answer. He thinks that what really matters is that we are rational agents, that we have the capacity for rationality or reason. Now, that's not to suggest that we are always rational or reasonable. Kant wasn't naive. He knows that we're often irrational, but that's not the point. The point is we have an ability to make decisions on a level that other animals, other creatures, other things don't. You might put this in a different way. You might think of it in terms of free will. So human free will has a quality that is different to that of other animals. And that's because we have this capacity to choose to be reasonable, to think and decide for ourselves in a different kind of way to other creatures. And so that's where Kant wants to plant his flag. That's where he thinks that ethics should start. And so from that, he thinks that essentially we need to always be acting on principle. And what is the principle? The principle is simply this: always do your duty, and the duty is to respect others as rational agents. Again, not suggesting people are always rational, but we have this capacity for reason. We have this ability to choose for ourselves, to decide, and to have free will in this unique kind of way. And so when we're deciding what we should do, we need to act in a way that respects that in other people. And Kant boils this down to a number of specific ways of guiding our action. He talks about them under the category of what he calls the categorical imperative. And if you ever read Kant, it's pretty thick and dense and boring, but if you ever read Kant, you might find up to 5 versions of the categorical imperative. Some scholars think there are 5. Most think that there are really just 3, but applied ethicists tend to focus on just 2, and those are the ones I'm going to highlight for you now. And the first is simply this: if you're making a decision to do one thing or another, You're acting on some kind of a principle. I'm going to do this because that's your principle. And you need to ask yourself, is that principle universalizable? Could we want everybody everywhere in like circumstances to act on that principle? And if not, it's the wrong thing to do. It's the wrong thing to do because it probably means we're treating ourselves as if we are different. It's called special pleading. We're separating ourselves from other people and treating ourselves as if we don't fall into the same category. And in a way, that's about disrespecting their rational agency. It's saying that they're not the same. They're not as good as us. And of course, that's not correct. And so we need to ask ourselves, is this universalizable? And sometimes we apply this in an informal way where we talk about the newspaper test. We ask ourselves, if this happened to be on the front page of the newspaper, how would we feel about it? We're asking whether we think other people would be willing to think that was the right thing to do in that situation. So it's this universalizability test. The second key principle that we tend to focus on from Kant is this: never treat someone merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end in themselves. Now, that's a rather long-winded way of saying what my daughters would say is, don't use people. That's essentially what Kant is saying here. He's saying don't use people. So let me give you an example to illustrate this and the previous one. Think about the case of lying. Kant is adamant that lying is always wrong because they violate these principles. So how then does lying violate this second principle of don't use people? Well, let me give you an example. Let's say I say to you, hey, won't you grab a coffee for the boss? But meanwhile, actually that coffee is for me, and I've lied to you. Why does that affect you as a rational agent? Well, of course, what it does is it means you don't have the full information you need to make a free and fully thought through and coherent and rational decision about what you're going to do. I've denied you the ability to exercise your rational agency. And so I've disrespected you as a rational agent. I've used you as a mere means to an end. Of course, we use people to our ends all the time. When we ask people to do things for us, that's fine. But if I use you as a mere means to an end, and this is what Kant is worried about, I've bypassed your ability to choose for yourself, to choose freely. And that's not okay. That's disrespecting you as a rational agent. Then think about lying in terms of universalizability. Well, Kant thinks that if we think about lying, if we think that as a principle we could say what you should do here is lie, well, if we universalize that, he thinks that actually what that means is ultimately truth would become meaningless, that we wouldn't be able to communicate anymore because lying has become a kind of generalized norm, and so communication just breaks down altogether, which is just completely irrational. We can't possibly do that. We can't respect one another as rational agents if we can't communicate with one another. And so lying is a good example of something that would violate both those rules of thumb, which are really about us acting on principle and doing our duty.